Most people believe that throughout our history, the term smallpox has always meant some specific condition. That is, it can easily be distinguished from any other disease by its unique and specific symptoms. In fact, this is not the case. Throughout history, the term smallpox has been used to refer to a wide variety of conditions. The same is true for such terms as leprosy and plague. In ancient Greece, which is the progenitor of modern Western medicine, any changes in the body or in the human psyche were perceived in a very negative way. Diseases were called defilement, which in Greek means miasma. It was believed that the sick person was unclean, that they had angered the gods, and were possessed by a demon. That person could not have any contact with other people because it was thought that contact with an unclean person could defile healthy people, and the punishment of the gods would extend to them as well. It was this ancient Greek superstition that formed the basis of the modern idea of contagion. It is important to note that in the most ancient forms of medicine, such as traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, there is no concept of disease transmission because they never associated disease with punishment. At the time, it was a Western superstition that, among other things, served as a great way to generate fear, not only for material gain, but also to achieve political ends. In other words, it made it possible to label undesirable individuals as sick, dangerous, incurable, and contagious in order to make them disappear in quarantine, in a plague hut, or in a hospital. Anyone who has had anything to do with the creation and design of prisons knows that most prisons originated on the basis of hospitals. The same thing continued in the Middle Ages. In those days, just as in ancient Greece, in society prevailed the religiously motivated idea that sickness was punishment for sin. The popular term for this at the time was leprosy. The symptoms of what was then called leprosy were constantly changing, to the point where a person without any symptoms could be called a leper. The attitude towards so-called lepers always remained the same. A leper was considered unclean and dangerous and therefore excluded from society. They were tattooed and forced to wear special distinctive clothing and a bell around their neck to make their presence known to everyone. As an outcast, a leper lost all their societal rights as well as the protection of the community. The leper could no longer have any social contact. They had to leave their family. A funeral mass was conducted for the leper because socially they were considered dead, even though they were still alive. This is why the German word for leprosy, Aussatz, translates as exile. How was leprosy diagnosed at that time? For this purpose, they used medical tribunals, which were common throughout Europe. They are described by books containing urban chronicles from the 11th century. It was at these tribunals that priests and city councillors decided whether a person was a leper and whether they should be expelled or placed in a leper colony. Leprosy was not an independent or unique disease. Leprosy, at that time, meant almost any disease, whether respiratory or skin disease. You could be declared a leper for absolutely any reason, even for conditions like hair loss, acne, swelling, or goosebumps in response to a draft. One of the tests for leprosy was whether you got goosebumps on your skin. Because of things like nightmares, if you didn't please someone, that person could denounce you, saying you were screaming in your sleep because a demon called you. You could be convicted if you laughed or sang too much. Another notable test that was done to diagnose leprosy was the singing test. You could also have been accused if you were suspected of witchcraft or if you had had contact with someone who had been declared a leper. If you had any symptoms, you were doomed, but if you didn't have any, you could still have been declared a leper. In the 13th century, the term leprosy was replaced by the term plague, which meant exactly the same thing. Just like leprosy, plague included a variety of conditions. The plague never had a clear symptomatology, it varied from region to region and from year to year, depending on which symptoms were most common. Even now, when you read about plague, you can see so many forms of plague: pneumonic, bubonic, septicemic, and so on. You'll also see that not all epidemics named in historical sources the plague were epidemics of the very disease that today is called the plague. All of this allowed the church, which at that time had all the power in its hands, to use the plague to control the population. For example, they could quell rebellions simply by closing entire neighborhoods and towns to quarantine, starving and killing people with the excuse that they were all sinners. In addition, people were subjected to forced treatment with mercury compounds of all kinds. So it is not surprising that medical historians tell us that in those days, people did everything possible to hide their symptoms, so as not to fall into the hands of the Inquisition, since sickness, the symptoms of any kind, were interpreted as the result of a lack of faith and the subsequent wrath of God. Consequently, people were treated only by authorized persons whose secret art was reserved for them alone, so that serious or dangerous illnesses could be treated only by them, the priests and the formed caste of doctors who still perform this function today. State power in Western countries has always taken care of the leadership and training of these elites, as is evidenced by their enormous power, especially today. The state suppressed and still suppresses all therapists who are independent, especially those whose therapeutic approaches work. Subsequently, the term plague was smoothly transformed into the term smallpox. Significantly, it was called smallpox or petit vérole, lesser evil, as opposed to great pox or gros vérole, greater evil, which meant syphilis. The term syphilis, like leprosy, plague and smallpox, was a collective term, but applied to people who were committing the greatest sin from the Church's perspective. The Vatican, with its virginity dogma, as well as Roman Catholic theology, which teaches the Immaculate Conception of Mary and thus declares all other people, especially women and sexuality as such, defiled, have concretized all these ideas in the concept of syphilis. The term syphilis is a collective concept and is a concretization of God's punishment for defiled people. If it became known that a person had an extramarital affair and had any actual or even merely presumed disease, pregnancy outside wedlock being on the list of diseases and considered a sin of the worst kind, they were especially stigmatized, not only by mercury treatments that disfigured and stained their skin, but also by exclusion from society. It was this concept that gave birth to the so-called venereal diseases, the so-called sexually transmitted diseases, which all governments are reverently guarding to this day, all the way up to modern-day AIDS. The term smallpox was used for conditions unrelated to sexuality or extramarital relations and applied to any skin symptoms, and in some regions, this term was also used for respiratory conditions and even cancerous tumors. In this connection, it should not surprise us that illustrations from the 13th to the 16th century did not clearly and unambiguously depict the so-called epidemic diseases. Modern medical historians often disagree on whether the artist intended to depict leprosy, smallpox, or plague. And in one of the earliest books on smallpox, dating from the early 16th century, one can see a depiction of the biblical character, Job. In the biblical texts, Job was a righteous man who fell ill with leprosy, so his image was often used in texts about leprosy. Those symptoms with which we associate smallpox today are not observed here. Gradually, as the power of the Vatican waned, after all the abuse and arbitrariness that came from the Church and the Inquisition, people ceased to have any trust for the religiously motivated explanations. Since then, diseases began to be explained by a purely materialistic interaction, and doctors took the same position that priests used to occupy before. As a result, the demon of disease was gradually materialized. The same idea of the demon of disease was transformed into the idea of the toxin of disease. People began to believe that diseases were caused by the so-called toxin of disease, which in Latin means virus, and that a person recovered because their body produced an antidote to the toxin of disease. This idea was supported by the fact that if a person regularly and systematically consumed poisons, such as alcohol, they could not be killed by a bigger quantity of this poison. So people who were afraid that someone might poison them, took poisons as a preventive measure, believing that they were invulnerable because their bodies were now producing an antidote to the poison. But in fact, as it turned out later, the body does not produce an antidote. Our liver produces enzymes to break down and neutralize these toxins. This is why a person who has never had alcohol can die if they drink a large amount of alcoholic beverage. Their liver is not used to producing enzymes to neutralize alcohol. But if a person drinks alcohol systematically little by little and gradually increases the dose, they will not die if they suddenly drink even more alcohol. This is something that people of the past did not understand. They didn't understand that our liver simply produces enzymes to neutralize alcohol and other poisons. They believed in the idea that their body produces an antidote. Because of this, they practiced such things as injecting pus and secretions from sick people through incisions on healthy people to form an antidote to the disease, thus protecting themselves from the disease. It was this misconception that gave rise to the idea of immunity to disease, the modern idea of antibodies and vaccination.